Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of England Leeds branch and on behalf of MILIM to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK, and a big welcome to our viewers around the world in Canada, in Israel, Ireland, and in the USA. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Dr. Nicholas Evans, and I'll introduce Nick in just a moment. You're welcome to ask questions. Please do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Can I also draw your attention to the chat facility? This will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded and will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the coming days. There on our website, you can also find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our speaker this evening. Dr. Nicholas Evans is Senior Lecturer in Diaspora History at the University of Hull, where he is also an academic in the Queen's Anniversary Prize-winning Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation. He uses the fruits of his academic research on voluntary and coerced migration through and from Britain to empower religious and ethnic minority communities, both at home and abroad. This evening, his subject is Forgotten Cultural Jews. A very warm welcome to you, Nick. We're very much looking forward to your presentation. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and it's good to come back to speak to the Jewish Historical Society of England, especially to the Leeds branch. I'm always proud to promote Jewish studies in the North, and so it's really proud to be able to speak this evening to you guys. So I'll just bring up my PowerPoint. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. So okay, so hopefully you can see this. So tonight, despite failing to disseminate information on what the talk is about, I'm delighted to see that so many people have joined us. I'll give an acknowledgement at first that if you'd thought I was going to be discussing cultural Jews, non-observant Jews, then unfortunately I've misinformed you. Tonight, instead, I wish to talk about some cultural Jews. I've called them forgotten cultural Jews, and they are people particularly with one thing in common. They're connected to Hull in Yorkshire, and therefore are part of the Hull Jewish diaspora, of which some in the audience at least have some connections. I begin by mentioning perhaps one of the most famous individuals who I'll discuss in a few minutes, and that's Herman Dubisky. If you look on this slide at the as I begin with Al Jolson, you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, you've got Al Jolson there. But actually, if you look very carefully in the text on the screen, you'll notice that actually the person who composed this very famous interwar music, popularized by Al Jolson, another Jewish figure who purportedly migrated through Hull and Liverpool on the way to America. We have a strong connection to one of what I call cultural Jews, and that's some of these forgotten figures who were part of the Britain's Anglo-Jewish community with a global reach, going beyond Yorkshire, beyond Britain, to America, the English-speaking world, and beyond. So during the interwar period, all three of the individuals that I'm going to talk about this evening had, from Yorkshire connections, achieved global influence. They did so through culture, especially through musical culture, or a degree of entrepreneurship with varying degrees of success, which I'll note in my analysis here. All three were at the top of their respective games. Lord Devine distributed a large amount of Europe's fine art to North America. So if you've ever gone to one of the impressive art collections in Canada or America and wondered where they've got a lot of their fine art from, he's the person I'm going to be starting with. We'll then move on to Herman Dubisky. He brought his BBC music band to Bridlington, the queen of resorts on the East Coast, if you believe the tourist literature today. But for several seasons in the 1920s and 30s, BBC audiences were often entertained by live music, band music, live from Bridlington, rather than Dubisky's winter home in London. And so really, he, as ahead of the BBC centenary next year, I wanted to mention what he was doing in the early 1920s to bring music to our patch in Yorkshire. And finally, in my case today here, will be Bert Feldman. You probably have never heard of Bert, like the previous two. You'll have certainly heard of the music he made famous, A Long Way to Tipperary, through to the White Cliffs of Dover. This was the musical impresario who actually promoted, decades before Simon Cowell made musical success, something linked with Anglo Jewry, something of a great success, and through that generated substantial wealth alongside maintaining his Jewishness. So throughout, really, what I wanted to ask is, what can we learn from these cultural entrepreneurs? Why are they often forgotten? Why is their Jewishness often forgotten? And why have places like Hull, that was the UK City of Culture in 2017, not made more of these stories to promote some of the and champion some of the cultural agendas in the shires far beyond London today? The work is not new. It is new for me, but is particularly inspired by recent work by my good friend James Jordan from the University of Southampton, along with other people in like Sue Weiss at Sheffield. And really what I wanted to do is to discuss these, because by studying them, we broaden the analysis of Anglo-Jewish historiography to include cultural Jews. And at the moment, happy to receive questions on this in the audience. We don't really hear enough about this cultural Jews beyond infamous people from Hull, like our own Maureen, who got damehood this week, or the last 7 days at least, and other people who have really made certain achievements through largely broadcasting. So tonight, I wish to challenge the centrality of the metropole in Anglo-Jewish history. The imperial metropole, like metropolis around the world, attracted significant musical talent of Jewish and non-Jewish origin. Their work in these large cities, particularly I'm thinking here Berlin, London, Manchester, New York and Chicago, occupies significant scholarly attention. Indeed, a recent work by a former colleague in the Kaplan Center in South Africa particularly looks at Jews in the largest cities that they formed a dominant presence in. In the UK, the centrality of London to our cultural agenda and our cultural history is particularly a dominant force. And yet far beyond London town, many people had great talent, and many people used the connections with the regions to promote their careers. Talent sharing was a multi-directional thing during the interwar period, i.e. between 1918 and the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. And I believe the provinces, as I do with so much of my work, deserve much more attention than they've received. Successful acts may have originated in the regions, but actually, having often gone to London to paint the town red and achieve notoriety, many maintained links with the regions for both personal, economic, as well as religious reasons. So they don't forget their origins, the key message really. And indeed, some of the acts, which I've already alluded to, use the provinces to bolster their metropolitan impression, to use the summer season, years before we saw it in the 1960s, 1970s on mainstream TV, to bolster their reputations, to bolster the audiences, and not just for the Christmas market. Crucially, so many cultural Jews, with the exception perhaps of some of the Lord Grade and his family in broadcasting, remain outside the attention of serious scholarship. And this is something I find quite perplexing and problematic, and particularly revealing largely of Anglo-Jewish history generally, that our museums and our heritage venues are more likely to remember manufacturing titans of capital or banking financial successes, rather than actually some of the cultural performers who enlighten our day, and particularly in the difficult, bleak life experienced in Britain during the interwar period. Between 1919 and 1938, it wasn't just a period of challenges, it was a key moment in the cultural revolution of Britain, as the BBC began to broadcast from London and reached new areas, and other cultural venues opened across the length and breadth of Britain, not just the rep theatres and the major cultural venues, but a lot of breadth of culture. And yet really, in the scholarship, we often hear so much about fine music, about fine culture, this really what I call, as a northern lad, posh stuff, but we often ignore some of the more mainstream entertainment which kept the masses, both Jews and non-Jews, entertained. The first person I wanted to begin with has perhaps garnered more scholarly attention within Anglo-Jewry than anybody else. He certainly made the fantastic dictionary of Anglo-Jewry, which a number of colleagues produced a few years ago. Lord Joseph Devine, baronet and then ennobled finally to Baron Devine of Millbank, was born in Hull to a Dutch Jewish immigrant father and a local girl. For those who are from Hull, the Barnetts are still well known. Many years later, to a Hull mother called Rosetta. This upbringing in commerce, particularly of selling fine furniture and then antiques, enabled Joseph to reach the higher echelons of the British establishment. He didn't trade largely in Hull. His father had moved to London in his youth, and he, from trading in London, quickly developed into a transatlantic commerce. You can see this fine portrait of him. I'm showing the one on the top right of him, partly because it's in the Hull Guildhall collections, and he was given the honour of having a painting of him commissioned as one of Hull's civic worthies, worthy to be remembered in the Guildhall and to be publicly told. And you can see here another portrait which he bequeathed to the Ferrens Art Gallery in Hull of his typical family life. He'd achieved a good social progress for a lad from Hull. And a large amount of Devine's awareness of Devine was not because of his commercial activities, nor indeed his cultural activities in dealing in art, but instead were because he was a major philanthropist. Upon death, he left a small amount of money, £1,200 or so, quite a small sum considering his property and the fact that he lived in Claridge's Hotel. Perhaps a lot of that wealth had been spent there. He was Jewish to his death and was buried in Willesden United Synagogue Cemetery. But crucially, Devine facilitated the movement of art from old Europe to North America. And in doing so, a lad from Hull really mixed in the highest possible levels of society. For anybody who's ever toured some of the finest artwork in the collections, either in Washington or in New York, you can see a range of items from furniture, jewelry, object art, or fine portraits, which are now had moved from old Europe to America. And we see in this image on the right, which is taken from the Getty collections, just one room within an enormous Fifth Avenue art gallery by the Lord Devine at any one time. And you can see it's just some of the fantastic tapestries and other things which here he was trading and making enormous wealth on. He wasn't, though, without reputational damage. The image on the left, which has shows the oldest portrait of a woman in European portraiture, was transported over to America at significant profit for Daveen, but was actually altered to make it look more like a Pisario, and therefore ruined permanently. Other objects which he altered significantly, some have said damaged, include the Elgin marbles, which you can see here, some of his largesse in the British Museum, where the Daveen galleries were just one of the many philanthropic gifts he made to a grateful British nation. So across some of the leading establishments in London and in America, we see the ongoing legacy of Daveen's activities. Whilst he didn't necessarily bequeath large sums to Hull, he did bequeath portraits which demonstrated his connection with the city, and he was very proud of these connections. So therefore, on the one hand, London gets this fantastic, enormous gallery in the British Museum. On the other hand, Hull gets a few portraits. I'm not sure really who got the good deal there, but certainly for me, as a scholar of Anglo Jewry, it's always interesting to see how individuals wish to portray themselves in portraiture, especially where they eschew any sign of their Jewishness. The second person I wanted to talk about today lived around the corner from the BBC. So when you've seen this, you'll just round the corner there, this is BBC HQ today. Around the corner, you will see where the house of Herman Davesky is. He's normally in his former home is normally the backdrop of any cabinet minister interviews around the corner from the BBC HQ. And so you will see this in constant form. But his image was actually pretty much household news in the early parts of the 20th century. Born in Minsk, like so many Litvaks, he migrated as a child from Russia along with his family. Although I'm talking about Herman, his younger brother was a much more famous musical child prodigy of the time. And yet Herman, throughout his career as a composer of light music, produced some 3,000 pieces of light music. His output was therefore prodigious too, and included some notable World War I hits, including one which I'll show in a few moments. When he died in 1947, he had made significant money. As an immigrant, he'd managed to accumulate a probate worth £4,500. And yet actually, most households had his music available pretty widely on new things called records, which were produced in the 1920s and 30s, and also other music in different form, such as music sheets that you could play for yourself. Crucially though, one of the ways in which Davesky became a household name was in his big band music. Although you can see here performing at Bridlington on the east coast of Britain, he led a band which performed annually from 1924 to 26 and 31 to 37 from Bridlington, a new spa resort and particularly emerging spa destination for the working class communities of Yorkshire, including the increasingly upwardly mobile Jews of posh places like Leeds. That's just for Malcolm, in case he's listening. He was regularly performing from Bridlington, and therefore Bridlington entered the radar of Britain because of this entertainer. And yet actually, although he was Jewish and proud of his identity, he was seldom described as being Jewish. Unlike the other two people I wanted to talk about tonight, it's actually quite perplexing. Many scholars have written about him and described him as Russian, which of course is true, but actually eschews any of his Jewishness. But the way I became aware of Davesky was not because of his music, I admit my cultural negligence and ignorance at that point, but the fact that actually in what was former Seaside Museum, it's now closed, in Bridlington, there was a cartoon of him, which in my view displayed hints of anti-Semitism, and particularly the animalistic cartoon of him, which portrayed him as polluting the minds of young people in the 1930s, especially women, keeping them out, dare we say it, till the early hours of the morning, and therefore fueling moral degeneracy in the East Coast resort. It was quite interesting, bizarrely, that I recently discovered one of the people he was leading into moral degeneracy was my great aunt, who performed in front of him when she won the beauty pageant there Miss Bridlington 1936. So clearly that's where the family moral standards collapsed, and it's nothing to do with me. But jokes aside, what we find is that actually Bridlington, not Scarborough and not other East Coast resorts, increasingly became a place where cultural production was often relayed across the length and breadth of Britain. Admittedly, it was light music. It wasn't your latest edition of Wagner or Elgar, but it was all the same, showing the cultural output of the region, and was a strong connection with Yorkshire. Dubezsky came to Hull and he performed in the city alongside his nightly performances in nearby Bridlington as well. And so actually, this was a person who was proud to be in our region, and clearly as manager of this light music performances throughout the interwar period was a good ticket and sold well. The surprising thing here, though, is how could he maintain his religiosity? And the surprising thing here is that unlike places like Bournemouth or Blackpool or other seaside resorts frequented by large numbers of British Jews, there was only one small bed and breakfast or lodging house that he could stay at, which provided Jewish catering. However, we know he stayed there because of the positive comments by the landlady. And so I'd like to know more about people who were Orthodox and went to the seaside during that period, if you have any stories. Crucially, whilst he wasn't born in Yorkshire, Dubezsky's identity has been appropriated by the resort with increasing ferocity since the refurbishment of the Bridlington Spa Resort, which you can see on your left-hand side, about 10 years ago. About 7 years ago, a plaque was unveiled too by a local author who'd produced a history of the spa. And so this one self-styled Dubezsky promoter, many years after his death, actually began to promote him in writing and in a plaque and in numerous talks and exhibitions which have toured Yorkshire recently. However, he's never once described as being Jewish. And so it's quite interesting, again, that he's described as Russian, linked to the BBC, the musical director of the Bridlington Spa, lots of things, but his Jewishness is limited, which is a bit disappointing, considering he's one of the most famous people who is Jewish to ever go to Bridlington. Apologies if there are any celebrities tuning in who could outdo that claim. So here's a bit of music I thought to lighten the load, just in case you're already struggling with my Hull accent. This is Dubezsky's most famous tune, not, however, performed by Al Jolson. Sorry about that.
Sister Susie sewing in the kitchen on a summer. There's miles and miles of flour on the flooring up the stairs. And Father says it's rotten getting mixed up with the cotton. And sitting on the regrets that she keeps up on the chairs. And she can knock at our street door and whispers come inside. And when you whisper Susie, and she says we're robbing her. Sister Susie sewing shirts for soldiers. Some skeleton sewing shirts are shy like Sister Susie shows. Some soldiers say that whistles say that sailors think that whistles. Then they sew 6 off-shirts for soldiers. Sister Susie sews. Sister Susie sewing shirts for soldiers. Some skeleton sewing shirts are shy like Sister Susie shows. Some soldiers say that whistles say that sailors think that whistles. Then they sew 6 off-shirts for soldiers. Sister Susie.
Nick, I think we've got a problem with the sound. I don't think you shared it so you might want to come out of share, click the sound button, and then reshare and do it again.
Which sound do I do?
So when you bring up screen share, you'll see a little button that says
Okay.
share computer sound.
Sorry, apologies for those who saw that. Yeah. so I do.
If you share it, can you see the one? It should be on your left. It'll be on the left. The little button that says share sound.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah, we learn something every day. Yeah.
So if you do, go back to where you were and just click on it again, and it should work, I think.
Okay, thank you.
That's
Does
it.
that work now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sister Susie sewing in the kitchen on a singer. There's miles and miles of flannel on the floor and up the stairs. And father says it's rotten, getting mixed up with the cotton and sitting on the needles that she leaves upon the chairs. And should you knock at our street door, Ma whispers, come inside. Then when you ask where Susie is, she says with loving pride, Sister Susie sewing shirts for soldiers. Such skill at sewing shirts our shy young sister Susie shows. Some soldiers send epistles, say they'd sooner sleep in thistles than the saucy soft short shirts for soldiers Sister Susie sews. Sister Susie sewing shirts for soldiers. Such skill at sewing shirts our shy young sister Susie shows. Some soldiers send epistles, say they'd sooner sleep in thistles than the saucy soft short shirts for soldiers Sister Susie sews. Piles and piles and piles of shirts she sends out to the soldiers. And sailors won't be jealous when they see them, not at all. And when we say her stitching will set all the soldiers itching, she says our soldiers fight best when their backs against the wall. And little brother Gussie, he who lisps when he says yes, says where's the cotton gone from off my kite? Oh, I can guess. Sister Susie sewing shirts for soldiers. Such skill at sewing shirts our shy young sister Susie shows. Some soldiers send epistles, say they'd sooner sleep in thistles than the saucy soft short shirts for soldiers Sister Susie sews. Sister Susie sewing shirts for soldiers. Such skill at sewing shirts our shy young sister Susie shows. Some soldiers send epistles, say they'd sooner sleep in thistles than the saucy soft short shirts for soldiers Sister Susie sews. I forgot to tell you that our sister Susie's married. And when she isn't sewing shirts, she's sewing other things. Then little sister Molly says, oh, sister's bought a dolly. She's making all the clothes for it with pretty bows and strings. Says Susie, don't be silly, as she blushes and she sighs. Then mother smiles and whispers with a twinkle in her eyes, Sister Susie sewing shirts for soldiers. Such skill at sewing shirts our shy young sister Susie shows. Some soldiers send epistles, say they'd sooner sleep in thistles than the saucy soft short shirts for soldiers Sister Susie sews. Sister Susie sewing shirts for soldiers. Such skill at sewing shirts our shy young sister Susie shows. Some soldiers send epistles, say they'd sooner sleep in thistles than the saucy soft short shirts for soldiers Sister Susie sews.
Okay, so apologies for that. Hopefully, can you now see the slides, Jonathan? Is that now showing again?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Okay. So apologies that the about the sorry.
No, you still got the YouTube on at present.
Okay, 1 second.
Think.
1 second. I'll just reshare it. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so hopefully you were entertained from that one, and apologies that I was dancing away to to the wrong silent music there. But anyway, we all learn with technology. So the final person I really wanted to discuss, and as someone who I would admit quite readily I'd never heard of until last year when somebody got in touch with me, was called Bert Feldman. Born in Hull to a family who'd lived here since the 1830s, Feldman was part of an increasingly middle-class Hull Jewish community who had made the transition from being immigrants to successful, skilled manufacturers and creators. The son of a piano player, it was claimed. I haven't quite found which piano factory he apparently owned. He was the nephew, nevertheless, of the thrice mayor of Hull, Harry Feldman. Quite a political achievement for somebody of immigrant descent. Aged 14, the family had clearly enough money for him to demonstrate at Pacer his charitable side from an early age, when he gave a ton of potatoes to the Jewish poor in 1888. By 1895, like so many people I've mentioned tonight, he moved to London. He made the quick transition from manufacturing pianos to instead commercializing sheet music, which was being produced en masses for piano-owning households across the length and breadth of Britain. He quickly monopolized the market, and decades before Simon Cowell made popular music affordable. He introduced famous tunes, which I won't introduce you to, hopefully you'll have from memory, of the Teddy Bear's Picnic, A Long Way to Tipperary, and of course the infamous White Cliffs of Dover. So many Jews therefore profited in or traded in music which was particularly popular in wartime. And therefore, as we're heading towards Remembrance Week next week, it's worth remembering the contribution that Jews have made to the home front in this way. Unlike the others who didn't leave substantial amounts of money, Feldman's estate was very, very sizable indeed. Of all the individuals we mentioned today, he'd left a probate estate of nearly £500,000. And so important was his back catalogue that EMI have purchased it. He maintained his Jewishness, although he didn't marry, and had received a service in 1945 at the Bayswater Synagogue, a synagogue that I'm pleased to have visited a couple of times myself. And actually what we find is that from this background in Hull, the images on the bottom right show his Mer, who was an uncle, as well as him as a young lad. He achieved great promise. Where he made the money from is to be questioned. I've not quite yet worked out which part he made through his work as a musical, cultural entrepreneur. But instead, certainly a key part of his catalogue was the creation of a Feldman's Arcade, which many of you may have seen if you've gone to the West Coast, and particularly to Blackpool. Now a popular public house, although there are others available for anybody who disagrees. We have something which was really the heart of his world, and it spread all the way round to this side part as well. And here, cultural performances of a variety of musical acts and other musical entertainments regularly sustained Blackpool, the working class capital of tourism in the north of England, and far larger and far more important commercially than Blackpool. Such was the success of Feldman's Arcade that he established one on Charing Cross Road too. So it's possible that actually his property portfolio was a significant reason for his the sizable probate wealth that he had upon death. Yet one of the interesting things about him that actually comes through was not that he was mourned by his family. Indeed, it's pretty hard to find anybody who is a surviving relative of his. So if there are any, please get in touch. But instead, that he was mourned most by his employees. He was significantly generous to them, loyal to them, and supported them. So actually from Feldman's story, what we find is not just somebody who was commercially successful, but also somebody who was nice, a quality that I've always respected people for. And it shows really that actually Despite the great success of many of these individuals, they maintained a humble identity. Indeed, when I found Feldman's home, or former home in Blackpool, I was surprised. It literally is a 3-bed semi, not far from the waterfront, rather than some of the grand villas that many people had progressed to by this point. Throughout all of the stories of the 3 people I mentioned tonight, I wanted to highlight how he's been remembered. And actually, the momentum to remember this Holborn lad came not from Yorkshire, nor from London, but instead Blackpool. Feldman spent half of his time in London, Charing Cross, and half of it in Blackpool. He didn't ever come back to Hull, and so he's one of the few who doesn't actually remember Hull upon death, nor does he leave any money, as far as we could see, to any distant relatives in the town, and certainly, as far as I'm aware, not to any of the schools in the city. But instead, through the attention that of trying to recover Feldman's memory as part of a historic England listing for the former Feldman Parade in Blackpool, we find that his awareness of him is slowly beginning to grow. Meanwhile, in Hull, the City of Culture for 2017, there was no real attempt or no real success to promote Feldman as one of the many Jews from the city who embellished and enriched the city's rich cultural tradition. Indeed, it was only Maureen Lipman, of all the Jews who come from Hull, who featured in any of the significant media attention and cultural representation during Hull's time as the City of Culture 2017. Something I'm pleased about in a way, because Maureen's a nice person and a great ambassador for the city. But more attention could have been given, I think, to people like Feldman because of his success in bringing music to the masses. Perhaps this is a foretelling about what Simon Cowell's reputation will be in years to come. I'm not sure, but anyway, we'll see, won't we? So to conclude, in an era when we often hear so much about cultural wars in the media and how they dominate media attention, ideas about conflicts within Anglo Jewry about heritage have remained uncontroversial. However, though Anglo-Jewish museums and heritage centres are gaining greater visibility across the length and breadth of Britain, how they remember working class voices remains limited. In 1894, as many of you will know, from a 50th anniversary edition of the Jewish Chronicle, Israel Zangwill feared absorption of Jews, that they would be hidden and that their story and contribution would be negligent beyond the financial districts of the Bank of England. And yet actually, part of Zangwill's fears have come true. Anglo Jewry, certainly in public exhibitions, is often ignoring much of the popular culture that we have discussed about tonight. Inclusive heritage is present, where it is present, it often portrays just one story, that working classes showed social progression, upward social mobility, that integrated and assimilated, rather than maintained their religiosity, and actually that identity was celebrated throughout their lives. Perhaps the progenitors of Simon Cowell should be forgotten for other reasons I'm not aware of yet. But I think in a particular, it's particularly sad that the only real use for these cultural stories I've said today is to promote culture in post-industrial seaside resorts or maritime centres like Hull, Bridlington and Blackpool. Please, by all means now, heckle, shout abuse, and suggest other names that I've missed, because certainly within the limited confines of tonight, it's been difficult limiting the story to just 3 people. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was a fascinating, really fascinating talk. And obviously your reputation precedes you, which is why we have such a large crowd of people who've come to hear you. Lots of questions. John Cowell is interested in theatre.
Is he a relation of Simon?
Well, it could be, and he's interested in the legacy of Feldman. He says, was the Feldman's Theatre in Blackpool named after Bert Feldman? It's been renamed the Queen's Theatre, presumably after the current Queen.
Really? Okay, that's interesting. Because one of the bizarre things was the who is it? Dversky, actually, so the second character I talked about tonight, actually trained the young Princess Elizabeth, now our queen, to play the piano so well that she trained in the wartime her father and mother, so the King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. So yeah, it's quite poignant there. That is another story. But yeah, it's interesting. I'll have to look at it next time I go to Blackpool. But certainly, by all means, it is the same Feldman's Arcade that's there. I don't think the Yateses can be there now, but yeah, there'll be hopefully other uses.
So the arcade was a form of theatre rather than amusement.
Yeah, it was a place for an arcade of different emporium of different activities, really. And so there's different light entertainment. There was different type of musical acts and things like that of people who toured the circuit, really. So yeah, it's something every night from what I could gather. So it's quite good.
Now, Dversky's interesting because, unlike pretty much every other Jewish band leader in the country, he didn't change his name. They all changed their names because they didn't want to be seen as Jewish. And
Exactly.
here he hasn't changed his name, and yet nobody thought he was Jewish.
It's interesting. I think in the First World War, presumably that was seen as favourable. Interestingly, at Bridlington, I did something of this for the BBC centenary, some broadcasting for that, and the amount of culture which was of German heritage was quickly dropped. So by the time when war broke out in 1914, nearly everything you could get in musically in Bridlington was of German origin or Austrian heritage. So they had to jettison that quickly, and therefore you can see why people like Dversky could make some great capital on that. As somebody who was really promoting his Britishness. But it is quite interesting. He never ever shed any of that ethnic origin, really. So I was really proud that he did that. Even in a place with so few Jews who lived in the town, that he was very proud of that identity.
John Cowell's come back. He says Feldman's Theatre, I remember, was some distance away behind the Palatine Hotel. And surely Feldman is well known as a Jewish name. Perhaps he owned theatres.
Could have done, and I think maybe that's where it is. He certainly had Shaftesbury Avenue. There were a couple of high-profile theatres in London. The success of Feldman's Arcade in Blackpool persuaded him to do a similar thing in London too. And so that must, maybe, like you say, maybe that's where the value with that property came from, that he had large theatres like Cameron Mackintosh would today.
Now, tell me about Devine altering these artworks. Surely he must have known it would ruin their value, or was he just sort of not concerned at all?
I think of all of the three people tonight, his ethics and moral stance could be questioned today. I was doing some reading just earlier, and they were saying how the Elgin marbles were permanently damaged by his attempt to alter them. The fact a donor of a gallery could alter things in those times just goes to show the underdevelopment of museum culture at that time as well, in the museum gallery standards. So yeah, it's quite interesting. He altered quite a few pieces to try and make them sometimes look older, represent them as particular types of genre that he thought would be more popular in America. And it wasn't just paintings. He altered quite a few things, but with paintings, you can scan them today, photograph them. So you can see that there was other things where there was a Leonardo in the Louvre, which he claimed wasn't a Leonardo. And other times he said other paintings he had were genuine pieces of artwork too. So the authenticity is something that's been questioned and really has undermined him. Interestingly, looking through some of the gallery catalogues earlier, if they did come through Devine's connection to all those objects is listed, and that may be as part of the provenance and therefore the reliability of some of these galleries' statements could be questioned, and they're mitigating against that. So it's pretty interesting, really, that this lad from Hull didn't quite develop the artistic knowledge he often made out he had, really, although we don't tell all of the rich patrons who purchased his work, including the Guinness family, the Mellons, the leading Rockefellers, the leading magnates of the world at that time. They were clearly flocking to his stores in London or Fifth Avenue of New York to get these collections, which literally are famous today. There's as cultural destinations in their own right.
Now, Malcolm Sender has asked a question. In your work on immigration, did you come across other Jews who were musicians or writers?
Yeah, I did, Malcolm, and it's a really good question. There were some people in transatlantic shipping lines who were Jewish. So we often think of Jewish musical, Italian musical people on ocean liners, but there were some certainly with Levy and Cohen names. And so we suggest their Jewishness is unquestioned. There were other people too who moved through who were actors, others who were musicians as well. And so it's less likely to be identified on arrival or departure. And that may be because some people thought if you put an occupation where you couldn't earn a decent living all year round, you may be at risk and therefore could become likely for a public charge, therefore refused admission to a country. But certainly there are some very well-known ones. The one I've been trying to look for years, partly because the Merseyside Maritime Museum claimed this for those who went to Liverpool between 1984 and 2010, they used to claim that Al Jolson sailed from Liverpool, but we can't find any record of that. So it's, if anybody knows of it, please get in touch, because I've been looking in the wrong places if that's the case.
Okay, Dawn Waterman is interested if you know anything about Jewish amateur theatre groups. She mentions the proscenium players in Leeds. Were there similar ones in Hull? I presume they were.
There were lots, I think, all over Dawn. So I think one of the people I was going to mention was the father of a famous Hull member of Hull Jury, Father Max Gold, who was an interwar act, was a turn until I think the 50s and 60s. And he used to perform all over, but actually managing to track his movements and performances was pretty sporadic, to say managed to earn a living from it. In terms of other actors, etc., yes, there are a large number of people across the regions too. One of the best databases is by Catherine Cockin, C-O-C-K-I-N, at the University of Essex. And she's done some awfully good work with the Ellen Terry letters. And so therefore, through there, we can track references to actors and actresses who were Jewish. Indeed, a painting of Terry was actually sold by Lord Devine into a national collection in the UK. So we can see this transfer between different types of culture and different performances too. I've never yet quite found somebody who's made an entire career out of it. One of the few exceptions, Dawn, that I did look at was Sid James. Indeed, Tony Kushner had a PhD student looking at Sid. That was his niece, I think. Another one of Sid's nephews or nieces got in touch, and I think a third relative did. So I actually looked at Sid James' arrival from South Africa during the 1930s. So it's quite interesting, really, how one of our more famous actors that was quite well documented arriving was somebody so famous as Sid James. So there's varying different levels of that. In terms of the country house stuff, there were private performances, like the often made famous by the stories of the Queen and Princess Margaret performing theatre at home during the war. I was not able to see necessarily any of the grand houses which had musical performances on, although, however, certainly one of the Sassoons who used to come to Yorkshire with the Prince of Wales's set was entertained by household performances by non-Jews in the 1880s, 1890s too. And one of the actresses who came along there is quite well known, Lily Langtry, of course, you know, famous mistress of Edward VII when he was Prince of Wales. So there are some references, Dawn, but not enough. And I think there's could be more work to do with those people.
This music that Feldman made so much money at selling, had he actually written these songs, or was he capitalizing on things other people?
No, he like with his background as this purported piano maker, he made eat a living through other people's labors. And so apparently it was pretty moral, a lot more moral than a lot of people at the time. So certainly for some of the more famous hits, I think Long Way to Tipperary, he gave the royalties for that when it did very well in the First World War to both the writers of that, and when they died, one of them died, he continued to pay the royalty payments. So he clearly was a man of moral fibre. And that's really, I think, a positive story to put out there, that actually he respected the integrity of some of these. I couldn't find any clandestine ways in which he journeyed up and down and made some, promoted this culture really to the masses.
So we'll close with a question from John Bowers, or Bowers maybe. He says, he's from the other side of the water. He says, are there any cultural Jews in Grimsby?
Yeah, John, I'm sorry, but as you will know, John, Grimsby is culturally deprived. I'm only joking now. Yeah, I think that I haven't come across any John at the moment. The most famous one you and I both know, in terms of Leo Solomon, who was both a teacher, a musical act throughout his entire life. I think it's like 7 or 8 decades until he passed away earlier this year. So there are some around there. Max Gold as well, John, is of partial Grimsby stock. So yeah, you can partly claim him, if his father, if you want to as well. So there are in all places, I think, some form of act, but I've not found as much Jewish entrepreneurship in terms of some of the further East Coast resorts like Skegness, for example, or Great Yarmouth. But there are certainly some Jews in Great Yarmouth as well. So there could be more work there. Certainly there were some Jewish burials there that I went to look at a couple of years ago, but not necessarily as many performances. Again, Sid James, interestingly, was remembered in the Heritage Great Yarmouth. So it's one of the family holidays in Great Yarmouth each year is spent by looking for any new references to Jewish heritage, which the seaside resort promotes. So it's be glad you're not related to me, because I'd be dragging you around there too.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for sharing the benefit of your knowledge and your research with us. It's been absolutely fascinating. And to say thank you, we'd like to send you a copy of Leeds and its Jewish Community. So this is a series of essays all about what happens across this way. Hopefully you'll be interested to read that. Now, let me share some details of our future programme with our audience. Next Monday, we have Leah Garrett joining us from New York to speak about her book, X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos Who Helped Defeat the Nazis. Then on the 15th of November, we welcome Caroline Shenton. Caroline speaking about evacuating London's national treasures to Jewish country houses during the Second World War. The following week, on the 22nd of November, autograph collector Adam Andrusier is with us to discuss his book, Two Hitlers and a Marilyn, and to explain how he was the inspiration behind Zadie Smith's The Autograph Man. On the 29th of November, the acclaimed author Michael Pye is with us discussing his new book, Antwerp, The Glory Years. And finally, for now, on the 6th of December, we again partner with the Jewish Historical Society of England and welcome Simon Goulden, who will tell us about Jewish lives in Georgian England. All of our events are free, but you can make a small donation on our website. The link is in the chat, and that will help to support our work and the costs of providing these webinars. We have speakers booked well into next year, so please do visit milim.org.uk, sign up to our newsletter, and make sure you don't miss anything. It remains for me to thank our speaker, Dr. Nicholas Evans, once again. Nick, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for all the questions. It's been great to speak to so many people. Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. Until then, stay safe.